Hello again. I find that the question of statues is still an active one in London, even though it's now over a year since those wretched youths threw one in the harbour at Bristol. As some viewers might know, the Mayor of London, the awful Sadiq Khan, set up a sinister body called the Commission for Diversity in the Public Realm, and they've been looking around for statues that they might dispose of and street names that they can change and so on. Particularly, they've been asked to rule on a number of very old statues in London and decide if they should be removed from sight. These are all white men who might possibly have had some vague connection with colonialism or held views which might be frowned upon today. The latest controversy is about the statues on the front of Deptford Town Hall, which was sold some years ago to Goldsmiths College, a London university. Deptford in South London was an area once with a very strong naval tradition, and as a result has statues of Nelson, Francis Drake and Robert Blake plainly visible on the first floor at the front of the building, as can be seen from the thumbnail to this video. Some of the students at Goldsmiths have been running around like headless chickens, demanding that these statues be removed because of their association with slavery. This is funnier than anybody can imagine, because one of those men actually fought a fierce naval engagement in an attempt to end the trade in slaves. In a newspaper article to which I give a link, Robert Blake is described as Admiral Blake, but he was of course nothing of the sort. He was a naval officer under Cromwell following the end of the English Civil War, and there was no such rank in the parliamentary forces. He was in fact General at Sea Blake, and is sometimes known as the father of the Navy in this country. In the first half of the 17th century, England and Ireland were targeted by African slave traders who seized the crews of fishing boats and landed in remote places to capture villagers and take them off to sell in the slave markets of Tripoli and Algiers. To give an example of what was happening, we need only look at 1 year, 1625. In April 1625, 4 ships sailing from English ports were taken by slavers. They were intercepted at sea, 3 from Cornwall and 1 from Devon. The crews were all captured and taken off to slave markets in Africa. From that point on, the situation deteriorated sharply until by August that same year the slavers were not limiting their attacks to shipping, but were actually landing in England to make slaves of those living in coastal villages. A raiding party landed, for instance, at Mounts Bay in Cornwall. When the local inhabitants saw the ships anchored in the bay, they fled to the local church in the hope that it would provide sanctuary. The African slave traders had no respect for any Christian place of worship, though. They broke into the church, dragging out more than 60 people and loading them onto the waiting ships. All those taken in this raid ended up in the slave markets of North Africa. On the 12th of August, the Mayor of Plymouth appealed for help to the Privy Council in London. He wrote that in just 10 days, 27 ships had been boarded and the crews carried off into slavery, over 200 men in total. His cry for help read as follows. The Mayor of Plymouth writes that there are general fears for the ships from Virginia and Newfoundland. 27 ships and 200 persons have been taken in 10 days. This is the slave trade, which most people have forgotten about today. After winning the Civil War, Oliver Cromwell was determined to put an end to this state of affairs, and he strengthened the navy to provide more protection to the coastal waters of the British Isles. More than that, he intended to put an end to the depredations of the slavers from North Africa if they caused any trouble at all to England or any English ships. Late in 1654, an English ship was seized in the Mediterranean and the crew taken off into slavery. They ended up partly being sold to slaves in Tunis, and some of them ended up in Algiers. Cromwell then dispatched General at Sea Robert Blake to the coast of North Africa with 16 ships. When he arrived at Tunis on February the 8th, 1655, Blake demanded the release of the English sailors, some of whom had been sold on to Algiers. When this was refused, the English fleet bombarded Tunis, inflicting great damage on the town. Then they moved on to Algiers, where the local ruler at once agreed to free all the English slaves under his control. He didn't want his city destroyed the way Tunis had been. It was a great victory for the English and struck a heavy blow against the slave trade. In other words, Robert Blake, the man who those idiot students and Black Lives Matter people wished to topple, was actually instrumental in freeing slaves. I suppose that the fact that those slaves were white and English means that his actions don't really count. Some of those students have said that Blake's statue must fall because he was connected with slavery. They're right, but his only connection with slavery is the two naval engagements which I describe above. He freed slaves. He wasn't involved with buying and selling them. Such is the abysmal ignorance of so many young people today, especially those in higher education, that it's probably hopeless to try and explain all this to them. This is the latest instance of attempts to remove statues of people who had never in their lives indicated any support for slavery, and in some cases, like Robert Blake, had actually risked their lives fighting against it.